The day the sun stopped. No one saw it coming. The models had all been checked. The satellites had reported no anomalies, and every telescope from Arizona to Hawaii kept scanning the skies as if one more frame might reveal the missing clue. But that cold November morning, as clocks struck 6 in New York and alarms buzzed in Chicago, there was no hint of daylight creeping across the horizon. At first, people thought it was weather, a heavy cloud cover, a freak storm, an eclipse perhaps stretched by some cosmic fluke. Morning shows filled airtime with meteorologists in brightly lit studios assuring viewers that unusual atmospheric events sometimes linger, but hour by hour unease crawled through every city. Los Angeles traffic, usually bathed in rising gold by 7:00 a.m., crawled through pitch-black streets under permanent high beams. Farmers in Iowa stared at frozen fields, waiting for the warmth that never came. The sun had simply decided not to rise over the continental United States, while the rest of the planet rotated normally, enjoying predictable dawns and sunsets as if nothing at all had happened. Within 12 hours, the power demand spiked to unprecedented levels as every office, school, and hospital lit itself artificially just to function. Emergency rooms filled with minor injuries from crashes, falls, and panicked crowds. The president convened an immediate meeting of top scientists, generals, and intelligence chiefs. No terrorist group claimed responsibility. No foreign adversary had the means. Theories ran from gravitational anomalies to rogue black holes to divine retribution. Satellites confirmed. The Earth still rotated, orbital mechanics remained intact, yet sunlight bent away from the region as if an invisible curtain had wrapped the nation in darkness. Social media fractured into hysteria, some calling it a government cover-up, others preaching end-time sermons that spread like digital wildfire. Flights were grounded, shipping lanes jammed as captains refused to approach a coastline now hidden under eternal night. Stock markets didn't just drop, they froze, unable to price a country whose daylight had vanished. NASA labs ran parallel simulations, trying to model atmospheric cooling rates, photosynthesis collapse timelines, and grid overload scenarios. Governors declared states of emergency. In some cities, volunteers handed out portable lanterns and batteries. In others, stores were looted within hours, shelves stripped of candles, canned food, and generators. News anchors, faces pale under studio lights, spoke in careful monotones as if trying not to ignite panic, but their eyes betrayed what they all feared. No one knew why, and no one knew when, or if, dawn would return. Children cried in classrooms that felt like basements. Churches overflowed. Gun stores reported record traffic, and somewhere in the deserts of Nevada, under the humming quiet of military bunkers, America's most classified rooms filled with the sound of silence, the kind that falls when even the most powerful nation on Earth realizes it has no protocol for the disappearance of the sun. The scientific scramble. In the hours after the first midnight that never ended, every scientific institution in America went into a kind of manic trance. Astrophysicists who had spent their lives charting predictable motions of celestial bodies suddenly found themselves staring at a sky that obeyed none of their math. Every major observatory pushed its instruments to the limit, tracking photons from every angle, running spectroscopy on a darkness that seemed to absorb the very data they needed. The strange thing, confirmed again and again, was that the sun still shone on the rest of the planet. Europe, Asia, Africa all basked in their normal cycles. Yet over the landmass of the United States, a vast, invisible shield bent light away. At the National Solar Dynamics Laboratory, teams worked around the clock building models of gravitational lensing, magnetospheric distortions, and quantum-scale anomalies, none of which fit what they were seeing. Theories multiplied like bacteria in a warm dish. Some argued a colossal dust cloud had somehow anchored itself in the upper atmosphere, but satellite feeds showed clear air, stars bright and sharp above a nation in night. Others whispered about alien engineering, a deliberate selective blackout designed either as a message or a test. Conspiracy networks erupted with speculation about classified energy weapons backfiring, secret experiments with orbital mirrors, or even a top-secret terraforming project gone catastrophically wrong. In subterranean labs, particle physicists began to map the possibility of localized space-time warping, a bubble of reality slightly offset from normal physics, capable of bending the path of light around a geographic area without disrupting gravity or air pressure. The math was terrifying. Such a phenomenon would require energies beyond anything humanity could produce, suggesting either a cosmic ident of unfathomable scale or an intelligence capable of casually rewriting the rules of light itself. Meanwhile, engineers worried less about why and more about how to keep a nation alive. Plants deprived of sunlight would start to fail within days. Temperatures, even in warm states, would plummet as solar heating ceased. Hospitals began rationing diesel for backup generators. Electric utilities ran predictive models and quietly warned state governors that rolling blackouts would be inevitable within the week if demand didn't drop. The Department of Agriculture convened a war room-style session, calculating grain reserves, livestock survival rates, and greenhouse capacity under artificial light. NASA, for the first time in its history, considered launching experimental reflective satellites, not for observation, but for emergency illumination, a desperate attempt to simulate daylight over at least a few critical zones. Every phone call, every secure transmission carried the same undertone. Time was bleeding away. In a country built on assumptions of routine sunrise, the sudden absence of daylight was not merely a scientific puzzle, it was a countdown to cascading failures, ecological, economic, psychological. The scientists, brilliant and tireless, had no precedent, no textbook, no comforting precedent to lean on. They could measure, they could hypothesize, they could simulate, but they could not promise when, or even if, the light would return. The first 24 hours of human response. The first full day of endless night moved through the country like a slow, cold wave. At street level, in thousands of towns and cities, people did what people always do when routine fractures. They improvised, they panicked, they clung to small rituals. Offices opened late, not because of policy, but because commutes took twice as long without natural light. Buses crept along streets lined with battery-powered lanterns hung from balconies. Parents walked children to school under the harsh glow of floodlights borrowed from sports fields. News channels looped the same handful of facts. The sun still existed. Orbital mechanics remained stable, and for reasons unknown, no photons from it reached America. Those words offered no comfort. Grocery stores were mobbed by shoppers clearing shelves of bottled water, long-life milk, and every candle in sight. Hardware stores sold out of generators before noon. Banks saw panicked withdrawals as people, irrationally but understandably, converted digital money into something they could hold. In city halls and state capitals, mayors and governors stood behind podiums, their voices measured, telling residents to stay calm, conserve power, check on neighbors. Emergency services adjusted to a flood of calls about minor accidents, fender benders at intersections, elderly people falling on unlit staircases, children wandering away from darkened yards. Police departments worked double shifts to keep looting in check. In some neighborhoods, community groups sprang into action, handing out flashlights, setting up volunteer patrols, cooking hot meals for those whose kitchens had gone cold without gas or electricity. In others, fear metastasized into anger. Gunfire cracked in the distance, and rumors spread faster than any official briefing could counter. By evening, the temperature in several states had dropped enough to be felt in bones. Without the daily infusion of solar heat, even well-insulated buildings began to lose their mildness. Power companies pleaded with customers to lower thermostats and turn off non-essential appliances. Broadcast radio, now a lifeline in case cell towers failed, cycled public service announcements on how to insulate windows, ration fuel, and identify symptoms of hypothermia. Air travel halted almost completely. Airports, despite runway lights, couldn't guarantee safe navigation without reliable weather patterns. Trucking companies rerouted shipments through Canada and Mexico, hoping to stage supplies at the edge of the blackout zone. Social media turned into a collective diary of disbelief. Shaky videos of skyline silhouettes, time-lapse feeds showing nothing but static darkness, threads filled with speculation, prayer, sarcasm, and quiet despair. The psychological weight of never seeing daylight gnawed at people in subtle ways. Circadian rhythms bent, fatigue arrived at odd hours, anxiety spiked. Some clung to optimism, reminding anyone who would listen that human beings had survived ice ages and wars and plagues. Others retreated inward, shutting blinds not to block light, but to hide from a world they no longer recognized. The first 24 hours were not yet collapse. They were the breath held before a long plunge, a nation blinking into a darkness it did not yet understand but already feared might never lift. The first week, infrastructure and agriculture. Under siege. By the end of the first week, the novelty of permanent night had burned away, leaving only the grinding weight of logistics. The United States was built on an assumption so deep it never had to be spoken. Daylight would return tomorrow. Without it, systems designed to stretch, flex, and recover under stress now bent toward failure. Electrical grids, already burdened by 24-hour lighting, began to fragment under rolling blackouts. Power stations rationed output in rotating blocks, plunging entire districts into deeper darkness for hours at a time just to keep hospitals, water treatment plants, and emergency dispatch centers alive. Municipal water systems, dependent on electric pumps, faltered in rural areas. People filled bathtubs and buckets, unsure when the next burst of water pressure might come. Agriculture was the first to bleed openly. Fields that should have been preparing for winter growth, or at least holding the energy from prior harvests, cooled and withered. Livestock in open pens huddled together under artificial heat lamps, many succumbing to pneumonia as the ambient temperature dropped degree by degree each night that never ended. Commercial greenhouses extended their operating hours with arrays of LEDs, but even their capacity paled against the sheer scale of national food demand. The Department of Agriculture quietly advised state leaders that stored grain and refrigerated produce could sustain the population for weeks, not months, if transportation stayed functional. Yet transportation was another domino tipping. Diesel supplies ran thin as trucks idled longer, as convoys rerouted to avoid urban unrest, as pipelines faced maintenance delays because crews could not safely navigate darkened sites. In cities, trash piled higher as sanitation schedules slipped, sewers backed up in low-lying areas where pumps failed. The smell of uncollected waste mingled with the scent of diesel exhaust and the cold, metallic tang of an atmosphere losing its usual warmth. Public transit, reliant on precise timing and coordination, became unpredictable. Subways in New York ran with fewer trains, often delayed by technical faults made harder to repair under strained conditions. In Los Angeles, bus lines were cut to preserve fuel. police departments restructured into skeletal night ops teams, working by infrared and flashlight. Firefighters learned to fight blazes lit not by daylight, but by human negligence in a world where candles and propane heaters multiplied risk. Psychological fatigue, subtle at first, hardened into a national mood. Without sunlight to anchor circadian rhythms, people lost their sense of days passing. Offices shifted to artificial schedules, 12 hours of work lighting, 12 hours of dimmed night mode to simulate some kind of cycle. But insomnia spread. Tempers shortened. Counselors reported surges in anxiety, depression, and paranoia. Domestic violence cases increased. Pharmacies saw runs on sleep aids and anti-anxiety medication. Churches became constant refuges, some open around the clock, offering literal and symbolic light. Talk radio throbbed with debate. Should people evacuate to sunlit regions abroad? Should states coordinate mass relocations? Should military assets be deployed to secure food corridors? The Constitution had no clause for the absence of dawn, but governors and federal agencies now governed as if at war, a war with physics itself. And in the sealed conference rooms of Washington, the questions grew colder, harder. How long before food riots? How many lives could be saved by controlled evacuations, and how many would be lost in the chaos of such movements? Was the darkness a fixed anomaly, or a moving one, a curtain, that might someday drift and swallow new territory? No answer stayed solid for more than a few hours. The second week, psychological effects, crime, and religious fractures. By the time the darkness had stretched into its second week, the crisis stopped being treated like a temporary emergency and started being processed as a way of life, a hostile, unnatural life, but a life nonetheless. Circadian systems, fine-tuned through millions of years of exposure to sunrise and sunset, had begun to misfire across the population. Hospitals quietly reported a surge of patients suffering from immune suppression, endocrine swings, and psychological distress that no medication could fully blunt. Sleep came in broken segments, people waking in confusion, unable to tell whether an hour or 10 had passed. Without the daily reset of daylight, depression deepened. Even healthy adults reported a constant sense of being out of phase, as if their minds were underwater, timing off by seconds they couldn't explain. In that neurological haze, crime patterns mutated. Police noticed burglaries and assaults clustering at strange, unpredictable intervals. Without day to anchor safe hours, every hour was a potential threat. Curfews were declared in cities where unrest swelled after food deliveries stalled. National Guard units patrolled highways lined with abandoned cars, headlights dark to conserve fuel. Their drivers long since fled on foot to anywhere with rumor of power or warmth. Black markets bloomed in abandoned warehouses, diesel by the gallon, propane tanks at prices that mocked any pre-darkness economy, cartons of fresh fruit smuggled from sunlit coasts treated like gold. Urban gangs reorganized around control of generator farms and water distribution, effectively carving out micro-kingdoms within metropolitan sprawl. Religion, too, split under pressure. In small towns, church bells rang continuously, summoning frightened neighbors into fellowship halls, turned community kitchens, and bunkhouses. Clergy delivered steady messages of endurance, promising that creation itself would not abandon them. But elsewhere, sects fractured, some claiming divine punishment, others divine selection, a purification, a sorting, a test to separate the faithful from the rest. Prophets appeared on live streams, declaring dates for light's return, each failure feeding new paranoia. Cult-like enclaves sealed themselves indoors, hoarding supplies and posting armed lookouts. In a few places, desperate congregations performed symbolic dawn rituals on rooftops, chanting toward a horizon that gave nothing back. Government messaging struggled to compete with this torrent of existential noise. Official channels delivered the same grim but stable data. The anomaly was still geographically bound, no expansion detected, no deterioration of Earth's orbit, no causal event discovered. But reassurance without a timeline curdled into distrust. Conspiracy influencers gained millions of followers by stitching together partial truths, secret military experiments, alien diplomacy gone wrong, even covert deals to sell U.S. territory to foreign powers in exchange for sunlight. Each theory gained power precisely because the facts offered no relief. Mental health professionals warned of a cascading cognitive decline in entire communities if natural light didn't return soon. Productivity across industries fell. Absenteeism rose. Violent incidents inside households spiked as stress compacted in rooms that never saw dawn. School systems, already on skeletal operations, began shutting down indefinitely, sending children home with emergency packets of lessons that parents rarely had the focus to enforce. The absence of daylight no longer felt like a scientific anomaly to most citizens. It felt like abandonment by the universe itself, and in that sense of cosmic betrayal, a dangerous emotion, arithmetic began. If the world could simply turn off the sun over a nation without warning, then perhaps nothing else, laws, economies, promises, had any weight either. The third week, cold, collapse, and migration pressure. By the third week, the darkness had gained a physical presence. It no longer felt like merely an absence of light but a weight pressing against skin, a reminder in every breath that something fundamental had been broken. The cold came first, quiet and steady, a creeping drop that penetrated homes, offices, warehouses, and hospitals with equal indifference. Without the daily infusion of solar heat, regional climates tipped downward by degrees that now mattered. Southern states, once warm even in winter, found frost forming on windshields at dawn that wasn't. Northern cities slid toward sub-freezing highs. Lakes froze at their edges weeks ahead of schedule. Heating systems designed to buffer against seasonal dips now ran non-stop, chewing through natural gas and diesel until utilities began rationing even critical loads. Portable heaters, wood stoves, and jury-rigged propane burners multiplied, along with carbon monoxide poisonings, house fires, and explosions. Infrastructure that had survived the first 2 weeks under strain began to splinter. Road maintenance halted as crews struggled without proper visibility or steady temperatures to cure asphalt. Bridges and overpasses collected ice that no longer melted in midday sun. Accidents multiplied, some spectacular, others deadly quiet. Rail networks cut schedules as steel rails contracted under unusual temperature swings, requiring constant inspection that manpower simply could not cover. The shipping industry, already crippled by rerouting and energy rationing, found its ports choked with containers waiting for trucks that never came. At airports still technically operational, pilots flew on emergency schedules only to ferry food, fuel, or critical medicine from sunlit allies abroad. The airspace over America felt like a wound, patched only where absolutely necessary. The pressure to migrate became impossible to ignore. Families with relatives overseas or in unaffected regions liquidated what assets they could, trading homes for passage on chartered flights, bribing officials to secure visas in nations suddenly wary of importing millions of desperate Americans. Border traffic at Canada and Mexico surged until both governments quietly closed crossings, citing security risks and food stability. Refugee camps, a phrase once unthinkable in domestic policy, sprang up near naval bases, where temporary sunlight simulation domes powered by nuclear vessels offered a few acres of warmth and psychological relief. States fought quietly over federal evacuation quotas. Who should be moved first, the elderly, the skilled, the politically connected, or simply whoever could reach staging grounds before they closed? Inside cities, civic order thinned like oxygen at altitude. Law enforcement, exhausted, began consolidating safe zones rather than patrolling entire districts. Entire neighborhoods effectively seceded, barricading streets, operating on internal barter economies, lighting their own blocks with diesel-powered floodlights. Civilian militias offered protection in exchange for food or labor. In rural regions, towns posted guards at highway entrances, unwilling to absorb desperate migrants from elsewhere. Hospitals made triage decisions publicly. Cases with low survival odds were turned away to conserve resources. Pharmacies locked away remaining antibiotics and painkillers behind armed security. And yet, alongside the unraveling, a strange resilience bloomed. Engineers in basements wired homemade light rigs for small hydroponic farms. Teachers set up ad hoc schools in warehouses, using generator-powered projectors to simulate sunlight for psychological comfort as much as for teaching. The fourth week, federal authority, military decisions, and the first riots of scale. By the fourth week, the illusion that civilian governance alone could hold the line evaporated. What had started as emergency coordination through governors and federal agencies hardened into a command structure that looked, to ordinary citizens, like martial law in all but name. The president addressed the nation from an undisclosed bunker, voice steady, but eyes hollow from days of briefings that never contained good news. He announced phased evacuations to international partners who had reluctantly agreed to receive a fraction of the displaced. He authorized the use of military assets to secure food corridors, energy depots, and transport hubs. He warned in carefully chosen language that the next 30 days would determine not only survival, but whether America would remain a coherent nation at all. Behind the podium rhetoric, the armed forces were already repurposing. Naval carriers, nuclear submarines, and amphibious ships served as floating sanctuaries, sunlight simulators, and logistics relays. Air Force cargo fleets operated on grim schedules, shuttling thousands out each day while burning through aviation fuel at a rate no supply chain could sustain indefinitely. Army engineers erected fortified convoys, black trains, people called them, that carried food, medicine, and portable generators across states in protective columns of armored vehicles and drones. Each successful run kept a pocket of civilization intact. Each delayed or ambushed run cascaded into panic that spilled from neighborhoods into entire cities. That panic finally ignited into riots of scale. The first wave erupted in major metro areas where evacuation quotas had been posted and names of selected families leaked onto social media. Crowds surged at airports and naval docks, overwhelming perimeter fence. So police lines broke. National Guard units fired warning shots into air blacker than any night remembered. In Los Angeles, a convoy of buses carrying evacuees to the port was hijacked by armed civilians demanding seats. In Chicago, warehouses storing imported grains burned after mobs looted them, not out of hunger alone, but out of the raw fury of people convinced that survival had become a lottery rigged against them. Military commanders, under orders to preserve strategic capacity, began making choices civilians had long feared, sealing off regions, not because everyone inside was doomed, but because keeping them accessible would doom everyone else. Roads were mined to prevent mass exodus toward already collapsing corridors. Drones patrolled not only for hostile actors, but for desperate civilians approaching critical fuel reserves. For the first time in generations, Americans saw their own armed forces not as guardians at a distance, but as immediate arbiters of who lived, who left, and who remained behind. Yet even in this bleak calculus, moments of raw humanity surfaced. Soldiers diverted rations to children at checkpoints. Pilots made unscheduled landings to extract hospitals full of patients left off manifests. Entire neighborhoods volunteered to stay put so that nearby towns with higher infant or elderly populations could be moved first. Acts of violence multiplied, but so did acts of quiet sacrifice, the kind no official report could tally. The fourth week closed not with answers, but with a map of a nation fractured into secured zones, contested zones, and silent zones, the last marked not by strategic insignificance, but by the absence of any remaining signal at all. The fifth week. International politics, science breakthroughs, and a flicker of strategy. By the start of the fifth week, the crisis had crossed borders without ever physically leaving its geographic cage. Foreign governments could no longer pretend the blackout over America was an isolated tragedy. It had become a global destabilizer. Markets had collapsed in sectors tied to U.S. production. Supply chains twisted into impossible knots. Food prices spiked in regions that once depended on American grain. The G7 convened an emergency session, this time not for financial coordination, but for triage. How to keep a nuclear-armed superpower from imploding in darkness while preserving the delicate balance of their own fragile economies and electorates. Diplomacy hardened into barter. Landing rights for American evacuation flights were traded for patent access, technology transfers, or debt forgiveness. Nations that had once allied without question began quietly competing for skilled American engineers, for military officers who could tilt regional balances, even for the chance to claim symbolic leadership in humanity's first prolonged confrontation with astronomical betrayal. In the UN, heated debates raged over whether intervention should remain humanitarian or whether America's collapse risked cascading geopolitical crises that justified, in veiled language, external management of its remaining assets. Allies whispered about joint trusteeships. Rivals floated the idea of partitioned stewardship zones under the guise of global stability. Meanwhile, in labs far from public eyes, science clawed for any leverage. Satellite networks confirmed the anomaly remained bounded, its edges eerily precise. Spectrographic data revealed nothing: no cosmic dust clouds, no exotic particles, no measurable shifts in orbital mechanics. Then, a sliver of something: gravitational lensing, patterns that suggested not absence but interference, as if some invisible veil were refracting sunlight away from a precise continental footprint. Theories mushroomed. A rogue artificial structure, a naturally occurring but unprecedented spatial distortion, even the shadow of a massive object parked between Earth and the Sun with surgical precision. The public never saw the raw data. What they heard, leaked through layers of fear and bureaucracy, was that for the first time since the crisis began, the mystery had a contour, a shape that could, in principle, be addressed. That contour birthed strategy. International coalitions assembled task forces blending military logistics, astrophysics, and high-risk engineering. Plans ranged from the grounded to the desperate, launching fleets of satellites to reflect sunlight back into the shadow zone, detonating nuclear devices at high altitude to disrupt what some hypothesized was a vast electromagnetic lens, even proposing kinetic probes, essentially weaponized spacecraft, to collide with whatever invisible architecture lay between Earth and its star. Each plan carried catastrophic unknowns. But the alternative, to wait and manage collapse until society hollowed past recovery, felt worse. Inside America, news of a potential breakthrough radiated like weak but warm light. It didn't erase the hunger, the cold, or the civil fractures, but it reintroduced a concept nearly extinct: tomorrow. For the first time since the sun failed to rise, families whispered not only about escape or endurance, but about return, not to the world they had known, but to a world in which this night could end. The fifth week closed with airlifts accelerating, governments recalculating, scientists working through sleepless cycles lit by LEDs, and a fragile idea spreading across continents. Maybe, just maybe, the darkness was not permanent. Only offended by something they had yet to see, and therefore perhaps something they could learn to break. The sixth week. Execution of high-risk operations and the cost of intervention. The sixth week arrived not with quiet resignation, but with a pulse of movement that rippled across continents. It was the week when theory stopped being elegant graphics on secure briefings and became physical machines, coded trajectories, and live countdowns. The United States, though battered and partially evacuated, still possessed the engineering depth to assemble dangerous hope at speed. Airfields that had gone silent lit up under floodlights powered by nuclear carriers anchored offshore. Rocket stages were craned out of warehouses like relics of a forgotten optimism and refitted with untested payloads. Satellite constellations designed to throw sunlight into the black zone, electromagnetic pulse projectors meant to jolt whatever invisible curtain lay between Earth and its star, kinetic rods carved from tungsten and cryogenically stabilized to punch holes through orbital silence. The launch schedules ran like wartime poetry, brutal, relentless, unforgiving. Each mission carried layers of failure points that in any peacetime review would have grounded them indefinitely. But peacetime protocols were an artifact of a vanished world. These were gambles, not guarantees, made in the shadow of a nation freezing, fracturing, bleeding out of time. NASA, Space Force, private aerospace giants, even international partners all fed hardware into the pipeline. Crews were sequestered in underground bunkers, sleeping in shifts under simulated daylight. Bodies timed to synthetic circadian cycles so they could operate at maximum cognitive clarity for windows of execution measured in seconds. The first operation, Project Lattice, deployed a swarm of reflective drones aimed to angle sunlight from unaffected latitudes back into the continental blackout. The physics held, the math was sound, but the reality was pitiless. The swarm barely nudged lumens across a footprint too vast to cover. People looked up from freezing cities and saw not day, but a sickly lattice of silver threads bleeding faint glimmers through an ocean of dark. Hope spiked for hours and then broke as the cold returned, indifferent. The second strike, Project Hammer, sent kinetic probes screaming into the calculated coordinates of the gravitational lensing signature. Seismographs twitched with distant impacts. Satellites reported dispersions of particulate clouds that might have been shattered debris or might have been nothing at all. No sunrise followed. The cost tallied in more than treasure. One of the launches failed on ascent, scattering debris across a coast city that had clung to order with aching dignity. Hundreds died not from darkness or cold, but from humanity's desperate reach at correction. Another mission triggered a cascading power surge through military grids, knocking out the very refugee corridors that had been keeping millions alive. Each attempt fed a second curve, invisible to politicians but brutal to field commanders, the psychological fatigue of false dawns. Every time the horizon glowed faintly from an atmospheric reaction or a temporary thermal bloom, people screamed in joy and then sobbed in silence as the black reasserted itself. Internationally, nerves frayed. Allies who had risked political capital to host American evacuees now watched in horror as nuclear options surfaced in classified memos. If the obstruction was artificial and massive, could a targeted detonation break it? And if so, what tidal forces, radiation plumes, or orbital shrapnel would that unleash on a planet still tethered to fragile gravity and fragile treaties? Debates inside the Pentagon leaked into foreign press. A war footing without a visible enemy, a plan to strike something no one could peep. Rove existed. The seventh week. Resolution, aftermath, and the memory of a sunless nation. The seventh week opened like the breath before a scream, a hush across a country hollowed by cold, riot, and evacuation, waiting not for news but for a verdict. The signal discovered in Colorado became the axis of everything: laboratories, military bunkers, diplomatic back channels. Even what remained of Wall Street now existed only to decipher its rhythm. What it said was unclear. What it proved was undeniable. The darkness had an author. It was not cosmic accident or planetary betrayal. It was intention, and intention could be engaged. Teams of linguists, cryptographers, physicists, and AI models were chained to terminals, parsing what felt like an alien heartbeat. Bursts of radio frequency structured just enough to taunt comprehension. Patterns emerged, a repetition at intervals matching Earth's rotation, a modulation that mirrored power grids still pulsing weakly across the black zone, and finally, a timed crescendo aligned with the sun's natural cycle over the Atlantic, as if to remind humanity of what it had been denied. The White House bunker became a war room, then a negotiation chamber, then something stranger, a forum in which generals sat beside poets, ethicists beside engineers, arguing not about missiles or mirrors, but about tone. If the darkness was a weapon, did humanity threaten in return? If it was a test, did they plead? Every option carried existential weight, too soft, and they might signal submission to a force that had already proved dominance. Too aggressive, and they might provoke an escalation beyond comprehension, a deepening of the night, a tearing of tides, an ending not only of America's daylight, but of the planet's delicate balance. When the reply was sent, a lattice of pulses broadcast in every spectrum they could flood, it was not a threat or a plea, but a statement, almost human in its bluntness. We noticed you. We are alive. We need the sun. For hours, nothing came. People huddled in shelters, in cargo holds, in foreign apartments that felt less like refuge and more like exile, eyes fixed on dead horizons. And then, just before what should have been midnight, a thin gold line appeared along the eastern seaboard, not sunrise in its usual arc, but a surgical incision of light slicing the dark with terrifying precision. It widened, slowly, mechanically, like curtains drawn by invisible hands. Cities screamed, churches filled, radios wept static into sobbing anchors. The sun, or some controlled permission of it, had returned. But it did not return everywhere at once. The light carved corridors, narrow beams across select states, moving like searchlights across a nation in triage. The message was unmistakable. This was not a restoration. It was a release, conditional, partial, a leash tested. America had been seen, measured, maybe judged, and now partially returned to a star it once took for granted. Governments framed it as victory. The people felt it as both salvation and humiliation. Children born in darkness stared at daylight as if it were magic. Adults stared with the quiet calculation of survivors who now understood that power, cosmic, alien, or something stranger still, could flick a switch across a civilization and watch its myths bleed out. Weeks later, when full daylight returned and the skies carried no trace of the veil, America counted its losses not in numbers, but in stories. Cities abandoned would never repopulate. Industries that died in the cold would remain artifacts. Refugees scattered across the world would not all return. Some would become new citizens in nations they had never imagined living in. The Constitution held on paper but bent in practice. Emergency powers had rewritten what governance meant in a democracy under celestial siege. Scientists published cautious papers that read like prayers hidden in equations. Priests delivered sermons that sounded like policy briefings.